Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be discussing a very important concept that could be used as an evaluation when answering questions on government intervention, such that oftentimes we encounter question in exams that asks us about indirect taxes and subsidies in improving the misallocation of resources, for instance in reducing consumption of demerit goods, or subsidies in improving provision and consumption of merit goods. And oftentimes even price controls are also imposed in order to reduce income inequalities, various sorts of price controls that could potentially be imposed to reduce income inequalities and make basic necessary goods more affordable, and or sometimes price controls that are imposed in the favor of producers by providing them with stable incomes and all of that. So we have, or different government intervention methods, like there are regulations to control monopolies, and regulations or certain maybe taxes imposed to sort of enforce firms to make them internalize the negative externalities, and also the state provision themselves, right? The state provision of merit goods, or state provision of essential goods, or state provision of public goods, or right. So I mean, there are various intervention methods that or that you guys already study in your AS economics syllabus. So I mean, and also in A2 as well, right? And so the thing is that all of these methods that the government uses in economies is used to improve market outcomes. When the government feels that the market outcomes are resulting into social inefficiencies and resulting into undesirable outcomes for society, definitely then it intervenes, right? But then, so government failure ka jo, this point of government failure is a very strong point that you can use as an evaluation when evaluating policies, and sort of making it sound like when would policies actually fail. So it's not always that. Also, so you see, there's one thing is that policies do have disadvantages, but just because they have some drawbacks or disadvantages doesn't mean that those policies would fail to achieve the intended outcomes. So despite the fact that they may have disadvantages, like indirect taxes to reduce demerit goods, I mean, indirect taxes are regressive in nature, so yes, they may cause income inequalities, but then it may improve market outcomes by reducing consumption of, let's say, demerit goods. So it's a good thing. So probably that's not government failure. The government hasn't really failed unless and until we have some more data to prove that. And we'll see what data do we need to sort of know whether the government has failed or not. But government failure is not about the drawbacks of the policy. Government failure is more concerned when the policy itself is failing to achieve its objectives, and it's a very strong evaluation that you can mention and also give a few points about that in your judgment paragraph, and I'll tell you how to do that. But when you're talking about government failure, guys, government failure is when when explaining, when I'm making this video right now, obviously my assumption is that you guys already are aware of government intervention, and you are aware of the the potential benefits and the drawbacks of government interventions, different policies like price controls, taxes, subsidies, state intervention, direct provision, and all of that. You are aware of that, right? Only then, if you're aware of that, only then you can obviously understand this topic better. So what you need to write in the exam is that government failure occurs when, first let's see what it actually means. So government failure occurs when the government intervention in the economy, it leads to inefficiencies and a misallocation of resources, ultimately leading to a net welfare loss. And ideally, we had to improve the society's welfare, and ultimately it's leading to a net welfare loss. So that's a bad thing, right? That's not what the government intervention was actually meant to be. Government intervention was actually meant to improve welfare. And it arises when the actions that were intended to correct the market failures or achieve desirable economic objectives, it ultimately results in outcomes that are worse than the problem they were meant to address, right? And we were trying to address the problem of demerit goods, and maybe we were trying to address the problem of monopoly exploitation, or maybe the problem of merit goods, or maybe the fact that there are very few hospitals and schools, and maybe where there are very few vaccinations being provided by the private sector. So maybe the government intervenes by providing it themselves. So there's direct state intervention. or maybe price controls, right? But then the problem that they were trying to address, that problem, the outcome that it resulted is so severe and it's so worse that, the problem that those interventions were trying to address looks smaller in front of the problem and the chaos that the government intervention has caused. And when that happens, when the problem itself that they were trying to address, when that looks smaller in front of the problem that the government intervention has caused, that's when the government policy has failed to achieve desired objectives. Such a powerful evaluation, such a powerful argument in your essay to nail the best marks in your essays. And so again, iska, what you'll say is, or another way of putting it is that when the cost of the intervention outweighs the benefits as well, resulting in worsening. So it's not only when you're saying that the cost outweighs the benefits, you're talking about how the misallocation of resources, the pre-existing misallocation, it just worsens more, right? And there's a greater loss and a bigger loss to social welfare, or simply when the actions that the government intended to achieve, it resulted in outcomes that are worse than they were meant to the potential outcomes are worse than the problem that they were meant to address, right? So, the point is that this government failure is the worst consequence of government intervention in a market. And the fact that government failure could occur, that is itself a lot of justification for probably no intervention at all, even if there's market failure. So, at times when question usually comes that should governments intervene to, or how can government intervene? So you need to evaluate the fact that whether intervention is really required or not. So even if demerit goods are being overconsumed or merit goods are being underconsumed, so what is the extent of that market failure? Or what is the extent of negative externalities that are being generated? What is the extent of environmental pollution? Right? So, and what is the extent that public goods might not, what is the extent that probably monopoly exploitation is taking place? So, the fact that government intervention could result in government failure, or there's a potential risk of government failure, is enough justification for probably no intervention at all, even if there's market failure. So what you need to write as students is that you need to bear in mind that, in your judgment or conclusion paragraph, you can write that, is the market failure or the problem that the government is trying to address so great or not? Is it really worth addressing or not? That whether it really requires government intervention or not? Because if government intervention does happen through taxes, subsidies, price controls, regulations, or right, so if it does happen, then is the risk of government failure significant or not? And if the risk of government failure is very much significant in this case, then probably we shouldn't intervene even if there's market failure, right? And because government failure is a justification to probably not intervene despite the fact that we have market failure, because it's going to worsen the consequences, right? And if let's say that the risk is not that significant, the risk of government failure is not significant, or probably there's no risk, or even if there's risk, then the risk is very small, let's say, right? Then maybe intervention is, in that case, you can write that yes, intervention is worthwhile. Intervening would, improve market outcomes, because maybe there's no risk at all of, government failure. And hence, in that case, the benefits of intervention will exceed the cost of intervention. But you see, if the cost of intervention exceeds the benefits, then government failure would result, right? And if government failure results, like I said before the start of the video as well, that if government failure results, it's not a small thing, right? Because government failure is simply causing inefficiencies to worsen, because government intervention is leading to inefficiencies and a misallocation of resource, ultimately causing net welfare losses for society. Right? Government intervention was intended to improve outcomes, improve the misallocation that exists, if it exists, and if we are intervening to improve that. It just worsened the market outcomes, right? And it just created outcomes that are so worse than the problem that they were meant to address, right? And this is what your narrative to emphasize must be, right? Now let's see that what could be the primary sort of causes of government failure. Now guys, one of the three primary reasons that you can talk about that why government failure occurs, after intervention is that you could talk about the administrative and the enforcement costs of intervention being very, very or significantly high, right? And when the administration and enforcement costs of the policy are extremely high, especially when the government is imposing regulations, different sorts of regulations, right, to make sure that the markets function efficiently. So the higher the financial costs are, the greater the benefits of intervention should ideally be, in order to in order for an improvement in overall social welfare, to prevent government failure. Because you see, if these financial I mean if the financial cost of intervention are very high, but the benefits of intervention are not that high, they are not enough, or they don't match at least the cost of intervention, the financial cost of intervention, then probably questions could be put forward that whether intervention has really been worthwhile or not in improving social welfare, right? So because you see, you need to understand that the cost of implementing and enforcing government policies at times may outweigh the benefits that have been derived from intervention. And the cost of implementing and enforcing these policies could be so severe. It's not only the financial cost, we're also talking about the administrative costs involved. They could be very high. And we know that government behavior is inefficient, right? Or at least in theory, it is inefficient. So the cost of implementing and enforcing those government policies can outweigh the benefits that have been derived from intervention. And if that happens, then that leads to an inefficient allocation of resources, again giving rise to government failure. And so again, the benefits of intervention have to outweigh the cost of intervention, both the administrative and enforcement costs and the financial costs involved, in order for the overall social welfare to improve, and in order to prevent government failure. Otherwise, government failure would settle in; it would seep in, right? Another reason why government failure occurs, and this is a very important, and this is actually a very common reason why government failure occurs, is because of the information problems within the government. See, governments have good intent. They want to solve the problems that exist in the market. They want to solve the demerit goods problem. They want to solve the merit goods problem. They want to reduce income inequality by imposing price controls, by imposing maximum prices. They want to make sure that the price of essential goods is below the equilibrium price by imposing maximum prices, and so that they could reduce income inequalities and make the price for essential goods affordable. They want to make sure that producers and farmers at times have stable incomes. So they impose minimum price. So they have good intent, right? And but the problem is that they may lack information. And when you say that they lack information, the correct word to use is that they may have imperfect information. Even governments may have imperfect information, and the information may not have. When you say that governments have imperfect information, you're saying that governments may not have accurate or sufficient information about the market dynamics, or even the behaviors of the consumers, or the preferences of the consumers and producers. And this can actually lead to very poorly designed policies that can actually fail to address the root cause of the market failure, right? Maybe they weren't really fully able to identify to what extent was subsidies required to solve the problem of merit goods, or to what extent was state provision required, or to what extent was the producers and farmers suffering from unstable incomes, or maybe to what extent or how big of a problem is the demerit goods problem, right? And or to what extent are producers damaging the environment? Because until and unless they know the extent, and they know the problem, they have information regarding the root cause of the problem, only then they can actually design efficient policies, right? So if the government has information problems, or it has imperfect information, and you see, you need to you have to understand that, like I said, policymakers, they do not have full information. Policymakers are not experts in all markets, and they're not experts in making perfect decisions either, right? So policymakers may lack information, and this usually happens especially when you're valuing externalities. Because in order to reduce demerit goods, the consumption of demerit goods to socially optimum levels, in order to improve the consumption of merit goods to socially optimum levels, you need to first identify to what extent is the lack of consumption of merit goods and the lack of consumption of demerit goods creating those negative externalities. For example, in the case of merit goods, to what extent the lack of consumption of merit goods is depriving the society of the potential external benefits, and to what extent is overconsumption of demerit goods uh, basically punishing society from the external costs, right, and the negative externality. So they need to value it, they need to monetize and attach a monetary value to it as well, so that they can impose the right taxes and subsidies. So, but obviously perfect policy making is not possible for the government either, but at least they must have good information available to at least design, if not the perfect, but an efficient policy, right? So, but a perfect policy would mean to perfectly internalize all the externalities, and to perfectly internalize them. I mean, if you want to implement a perfect policy, that would mean to perfectly internalize the externalities such that all the externalities, be it positive or negative externalities, are accounted for in the price and quantity. And the firms sort of, after imposition of those externalities, firms factor in those external benefits and costs into, production, and to produce outcomes that are socially optimum, right? So that the price and the quantity factors in external benefits and external costs as well after imposing taxes and subsidies. And hence those outcomes result in socially optimum levels. But then policymakers are not expert in the markets, right? They are neither experts in perfect decision making, right? So they may not be able to accurately quantify negative and positive externalities that exist, and hence they may not be able to effectively enact policies that should have been set at the right level, right? So if we're talking about taxes, and if let's say the taxes, if the tax or the subsidy or the state provision, etc., all of this is set too low than what it should be set, then there may not be any improvements in social welfare, and there might not be more efficient allocation of resources to sort of outweigh the cost of intervention. So you need to understand that there is a cost of intervention involved. So we don't have a problem with the cost of intervention. We don't have a problem with drawbacks. We're not saying that, oh, you know what, and this is where the students make the mistakes. They say, oh, you know what, indirect taxes are regressive. Oh, you know what, there's a problem with subsidies. Subsidies have an opportunity cost. Oh my God, it's going to waste government funds. See, all policies or all intervention methods have drawbacks, and there's a cost of intervention. It is only whether the improvements to resource allocation that was intended to be made, has it been made to an extent that it overpowers or outweighs the cost of intervention. If yes, then that's cool, then policy is successful. But if no, then there's government failure, right? So you need to be very careful in the way you are writing, and examiners do take note of this, and they will penalize you if it is wrongly written. So we are saying that if government intervention through taxes, subsidies, or state provision is set too low, there may not be improvements in social welfare, and there might not be improvements in resource efficiency of the resource allocation, such that those may not outweigh the cost of intervention. Those may not outweigh the cost of intervention, resulting in government failure. While on the other hand, if the taxes, subsidies, or state provision is set too high, way too high, than what it should have been to result in improvements or marginal improvements in resource allocation, then it may result in various unintended consequences that probably need funding to be dealt with, or that worsens, or just worsens the pre-existing problem, generating higher costs of intervention than benefits from this policy. Because you see, there could be the problem of black markets as well, that that needs policing by the government then, and that results in additional cost, right? So again, that needs additional funding, or probably, you just sort of imposed, you probably ended up imposing price controls to a level that maybe let's say that you imposed a minimum price that was way too high, and that created a severe surplus in the market, and the government would then need to buy up that surplus through intervention buying, and again that would mean significant opportunity costs, and if that is coming at the expense of probably future tax increases to fund that, or maybe some essential cuts to government spending, then we need to see what is actually going on here, what's wrong here, And is the benefits outweighing the cost of intervention or not? Or are the resulting unintended consequences so severe that they are resulting in the cost of intervention outweighing the benefits of intervention? And in fact, they are just making the pre existing problem of misallocation more worse than before. Right? So these are all the things that policymakers must consider before just imposing taxes and subsidies and price controls and regulation or state provision. And more importantly, you as students of AS economics must be aware of these. Must be aware. You must be aware, whether you are an AS student or an A2 student, you must be aware of government failure. Right? Also, guys, remember another major thing that I also touched upon in the second point as well is about the unintended consequences. And we talk about unintended consequences, we're talking about those side effects that were not anticipated, right? Such as creation of black markets, right? Such as maybe reducing, incentives for productivity. Maybe taxes have been set too high that it reduces incentives for productivity, for businesses. Or maybe, we also know that taxes distort market signals or price signals as well. So those consequences that, or those side effects that were not anticipated, and they are so severe that they just result into cost of the policy outweighing the intervention, right? Outweighing the benefits of intervention. So if there are unintended consequences, guys, that result from government intervention, that, so you see the thing is that you have to understand that the government is working in the best interest of society. But policymakers might ignore some very small things that, while formulating the policies that can cause unintended consequences, right? So, our question, we are not questioning the intent of the government, right? The intent of the government is good, to improve market outcomes and to improve society's welfare, right? And for example, the argument that you give about the formation of black markets, right? Even when you're imposing, when you're imposing these price control, let's say you impose a maximum price. Now, a maximum price might result in shortages, which may, again create black markets, or may result in smuggling, which might again result in excessive policing by the government. Or the government might end, or people might find up alternative supply of goods. Or maybe even, let's say, or if you impose regulations or controls to sort of regulate maybe monopolistic practices, or maybe you try to impose regulations regarding the extent of negative externalities and carbon emissions that can be released, maybe firms will cheat on, if those regulations are so excessive, then firms may cheat on those regulations. Or maybe the firms may just waste the subsidies. Firms may use subsidies incorrectly, or they might just become so too dependent on them. Now, the thing is that this wasn't really the government's objective. Governments didn't anticipate that. I mean, governments didn't really want that to happen. Governments didn't. So the government will be like, oh, you know what? We were trying to improve market outcome. We never wanted them to be too dependent on us. It's not our problem, obviously, right? But then again, so the thing is that, again, even with respect to state provision, if the government, provides state provision free of cost at the point of consumption, such as government providing education or healthcare free of cost at the point of consumption, it may create an excess demand, because government's supply of goods and services would be fixed, right? It would be constant and fixed, but the demand may be too high, especially if the government is not charging anything. So it may create an excess demand. So again, that itself will create a lot of problems. And so then these problems may need funding by the government to be dealt with, or again, they may just worsen the pre-existing problem of misallocation of resources, or may just worsen the pre-existing market failure, again resulting into higher costs than benefits of the policy, resulting in market failure. So, I mean, policies should be thoughtfully curated, right, in order to reduce the extent of the problems, right, guys? And so, again, when I talk about government intervention is a very, very there's this argument that is made that public sector organizations, they lack that competitive pressure. And at times, if the government itself is providing goods and services, maybe the fact that they don't have competitive pressure, and that, because competitive pressure drives efficiency in the private sector. But then again, the fact that it's private sector organizations providing goods and services, which can actually result in inefficiency, probably mismanagement, waste and delays, and that could itself be an argument for, or it could again, give rise to government failure. So you see, what you need to sort of understand is that, the government intervention was intended to cure market failure. And market failure is basically a situation where free markets lead to inefficient outcomes like externalities, lack of public goods, monopolies. While government failure while government intervention is intended to reduce market failure, but it can actually result into government failure. And government failure would occur when attempts to correct these market failures through government intervention would actually make the situation worse. And here's a challenge for policymakers, the key challenge for policymakers is to design intervention policies that minimize the risk of government failure, not eliminate them. It's not possible. The risk of government failure will always exist. To minimize the risk of government failure while effectively addressing market inefficiencies at the same time. Right? To minimize, number one, to minimize the risk of market failure, and number two, to address the market inefficiencies at the same time. This is what you need to actually write. Right? And also do remember the fact that, do consider or do make note of this fact as well in your answers, that if the risk of government failure is very high with intervention, then there is very strong rationale for no intervention at all, even if there is market failure. Right? So even if there's a misallocation of resource and there's a loss of social welfare, still there is rationale for no intervention, especially if the risk of government failure is significantly high. Because in that case, you see, if government failure happens, then government failure would make these outcomes worse, and thus intervention should be avoided at all costs. Right? Because if the cost of intervention is very high, then questions must be asked regarding, is the market failure so significant that we should intervene or not? Questions must be asked regarding the extent of market failure, or whether even there is a market failure that needs intervention. Probably not all market failures need intervention, at least at that time maybe. Or therefore whether, the government intervention is justified or not, or required or not. Right? Because if the market failure and welfare loss that is being generated because of that market failure is very small or minimal, or if there isn't any market failure at all, let's say, then probably government intervention, if done, could potentially lead to government failure, and hence that should be avoided. So again, policymakers must think about all these outcomes. They must weigh up these outcomes and put their head around them. So the fact, I'll again say the same thing, that government failure, the fact that government failure could potentially exist, that highlights the importance of carefully evaluating the costs and benefits of intervention, and while at the same time ensuring that policies, that when government forms these policies through taxes, subsidies, regulations, state provision, or minimum or price controls, these policies are informed. They are probably researched upon. They are informed by evidence. They are implemented efficiently. And at the same time, it's not that the government implements the policy and then leaves, and then there's no check and balance. It should be regularly reviewed as well. Maybe the policy needs some revision, right? And so, right, guys. So I think I should be ending the video here, and I hope I've covered this topic properly. In fact, I have actually, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do like the video, guys, do comment below and do subscribe to my channel. I'll be posting more videos for you guys. I'll see you all until the next video. Until then, take care.